Welcome to the internal panel, titled Why Does Platypus Host the Conversation on the left. For our panelists, we have Ben Katz, Lori Rojas, Andreas Wintersberger, Richard Rubin, and Spencer Leonard. So as for the prompt, Platypus aims to overcome the thought taboos which would otherwise prevent self-reflection by the left. Although Platypus existed as an informal reading group, the founding of the organization was to facilitate public fora. Subsequently, it's been understood that doing Platypus cannot be reduced to the reading group, but involves engaging the left through our public activity. As Ian Morrison noted in Platypus Synthesis, we must host a conversation that would otherwise not happen, and we must demonstrate to others that the Platypus conversation can even happen at all. Yet Platypus's activity should not... Yet Platypus's activity should not affirm itself through its continuation, but rather raises the question of whether we are just going through the motions. Platypus, originally envisioned as a relatively short-term project, is now well into its second decade, with chapters more run. If Spencer Leonard is correct in speculating that, quote, the inherited practices of Platypus are in danger of being both neglected and increasingly misunderstood, unquote, then we are tasked with revisiting the question of why we host a conversation on the left, and what that means in the present moment. Why do we engage the dead left? Can we learn from it? In what ways is this expressed in our panels, teach-ins, and the PR? Does our organizational growth affect our activity? And how does our current moment affect how we do Platypus? So we're going to have the speakers go a little bit out of the order in which they're seated in. So let's start with Lori.
Thank you. Thank you all. Oh, good.
Hello.
Okay. Let me figure. Okay. Thank you all for joining today. So we're going to be going through Why Does Platypus Host the Conversation on the left. My major theme, it's going to be a bit fragmented, but my major theme really is about hopefully getting us to a place where we can reflect on this changing nature of hosting the conversation through a glass darkly. I'm going to start taking inspiration from a PR Platypus Review essay by Chris Mansour called I Can't Go On, I'll Go On. And we'll use the image presented in his introduction. In Benjamin's Arcades project, capitalist modernity is in several instances depicted as hellish. He describes this condition as history continuing to truck along in its course, but only doing so regressively. Hell, in short, is a transiency without progress. Here, Benjamin is not voicing a romantic sensibility. He does not bemoan modernity for having trampled over the once harmonious and organic way of life supposedly experienced in pre-modern times. Nor did Benjamin understand modernity theologically as the age simply despair or damnation, even if he often used theological terms in expressing this understanding. Rather, Benjamin saw that modernity had achieved an unprecedented qualitative leap in human history, one that could actually further social freedoms for all of humanity in ways hitherto unimaginable. So, if modernity offered this progressive possibility, why did he describe it as hellish regression? So, two things that I will continue with that hellish image is Platypus' inception is rooted in the aftermath of the left's historical self-dissolution, self-liquidation, right? And we, in our founding moment in hosting that conversation, we put an emphasis on the necessity of confronting the left's evasion of its own complex history. It was talked about earlier, right? The ways in which silence or absence of a conversation is something that we have to learn how to navigate. So, I will briefly revisit our initial impetus for hosting the conversation in order to get to the changing nature of what it might mean to host a conversation on the left today. Platypus was founded in response to the failure of the anti-war movement, and we were motivated to host a conversation on the potential political reasons for this. This was slandered by the existing dead left as somehow opposing the anti-war movement as pro-imperialist academic claptrap, or whatever. But what we were opposed to was a less fatal misleadership. And we wanted to open the broadest possible discussion of the problem of such misleadership and miseducation. It is not an accident that we hosted our first public forum as a conversation between various different anti-imperialist perspectives. So Platypus organized our first 2 public forums in 2007, first being Imperialism, What is it? Why should we be against it? And the 3 R's, Reform, Revolution, or Resistance, the problematic forms of anti-capitalism today. Think about the whole titles, of course. These were very early attempts at hosting the conversation on the left, attempts that in some respects we continue to regard as models for our project. So we were founded in order to host the conversation, right? The statement of purpose was created in order to, founding of the organization was created in order to not just be a reading group, to organize an event, to organize the conversation. So back then, hosting the conversation was about what it means to be on the left and what it once meant to be on the left. We did this primarily by triangulating the reading groups, panels that would bring many perspectives on the left onto campuses, especially making the activists and academic leftists speak to each other in front of students. And then in the same year, 2007, our publication, the Platypus Review, eventually became our forum in print for the same project. This whole dynamic, of course, eventually became the tripod, right? Platypus wasn't founded with the idea of the tripod. This was part of the trial and error, where we learned what could work and how we can make things work. So, from the beginning in November 2007, the Platypus Review set out tentatively, but unmistakably, to host a conversation on the left as organizations forum in print. Unlike traditional leftist publications, the Platypus Review does not echo a singular party line or ideology. It is a forum that puts display, curates, objectifies, museumifies the death of the left and in our time. The publication ethos is evident in the inclusion of wide-ranging genres, interviews, reviews, member articles, responses to articles, and edited transcripts from our public forums, ensuring not only wide-ranging perspectives, but the conversation we host between those perspectives. The questions we ask them, the potential new things those dynamics may unexpectedly spark, are objectified as well as highlighting, as well, the need to highlight the silences or what is absent. Platypus is not teaching that the left is dead as a theoretical proposition, but making that death palpable in our hosting of the conversation. By making that death palpable, it's not only that we give it concrete form as an object, capable of being touched or felt, tangible, easily perceptible, so obvious that it can easily be seen or known, a feeling so strong that it seems that it can be touched and physically felt, but that we can make it able to be perceived. So I'm guessing I've said too much already, so I'm going to jump forward. How are we doing time? Well, it's not fine because we have a lot. But in the past, people did recognize, okay, actually this is where. So from its inception, Platypus, we understood the present to be fundamentally conditioned by the defeats of the left in a way that is wholly obscure to the present. Right? Events like the failure of 1848 revolutions in Europe and the rise of fascism in the early 20th century affected the subsequent development of failures of the left. Right? These historical events help explain phenomena like the rise of Stalinism and challenges to historical materialism. In the past, people did recognize the conditions based on defeats of the left, but they anticipated a resurgence or a renewal of that revolutionary project, especially since the French Revolution. Defeats, even in 1848, were opportunities to learn critical lessons, demonstrating to Marx, for example, the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat in future revolutions. We believe that the death of the left was conditioned most fundamentally by this failure to address the question of Stalinism, a fundamental question of the new left, the inability or unwillingness of the new left of the 1950s and 1960s to address the issue of the old left from 1920s and 30s, had failed to bring about socialism in the core capitalist countries, is one of the principal reasons the crisis of historical consciousness. The new left understood that the communist project that emerged out of the October Revolution needed to be superseded, and it understood itself to be a new form of revolutionary Marxism. But our view is that the new left failed to carry out that global revolution in a way that is not instructive. We cannot learn from it the way that we can learn from the Second International, or the way the Second International learned from 1789, 1848, or 1871 Instead, their failure obscures the present. The inability of the new left to stop repeating the failures of its time resulted in a context of deep historical confusion and regression that we have inherited today. So, there is a real question about what might mean to host the conversation today. Whether or not we can still learn from the left, because it's not what it was before. I want to acknowledge the obvious fact that there will be diminishing returns as we continue, and yet the presentation that we just witnessed actually shows that we have sharpened the saw as well, right? That we have gotten way more explicit and better at how to create a wedge, interrupt the current miseducation. So what kind of learning are we doing? This is my last paragraph. If we are to consider whether hosting the conversation is no longer possible, it would mean Platypus needs to dissolve. The work is done, and there's nothing else to do but shift through the archive. We like to say that what makes Platypus unique is our theory of regression, which we know it's not original to us, but nonetheless stands out in the present. But what is truly unique to Platypus, to us, what we were founded to create, was to host a conversation on the left that is not taking place anywhere else. Without Platypus, it truly is the case that possibly in a decade, the memory of Marxism would disappear completely. So we have to really think about what motivates this today, what motivates you guys, the newer generations, what motivates you to ask the questions about the left, what makes you curious about the left. And it is basically not to some sort of deep lore of a founding member to tell you what it means to host a conversation, right? It's up to you to take up the statement of purpose and find meaning in yourselves in it, right? It's up to you to find meaning in what the founding members, for the conditions of possibility of Platypus that the founding members created. But it really is the work of just creating those conditions of possibility that the founding moment is about. But it is you guys that have to pick up that torch and give meaning to the statement of purpose in the new historical context.
Hi.
Spencer?
I was a late addition to this panel, and I'm going to keep my remarks quite short. I speak often enough on this subject on the OrgCom, and a lot of what I have to say is regularly reported in Aaron's reports. But I do want to take the opportunity to participate in the Q&A. I do want to also mark that this is in many ways anticipating our membership meeting on Sunday. The thing to stress about why we host a conversation on the left is that everybody else and nobody else does it now, right? We see a lot of conversations on the left, leftists interviewing other leftists, podcasts, various kinds of imitations of Platypus. And that is the legacy of Platypus. Nevertheless, I would argue that Platypus remains distinctive. And so the underlying question of the viability of hosting the conversation on the left is what is distinctive about what we do and how vital is what we do today. All the changes in our circumstances notwithstanding, what Ian Morrison said in the Platypus Synthesis, which is quoted in the prompt for this panel, remains true, I would argue, and have argued in this organization for some time. He wrote, we must host a conversation that would not otherwise happen, and we must demonstrate to others that this conversation can even happen at all. Why must we do so? Because otherwise, then as now, the left would really just carry on. So Platypus serves an essential function. The panel prompt says, Platypus aims to overcome the thought taboos which would otherwise prevent self-reflection by the left. And of course, the most inviolable taboo on the left is on reflection itself. We look at various mirrors in the past, and we used to emphasize this perhaps more than we do. We used to emphasize this more than we do, I think, today, or at least regularly. Which is to say, to see Platypus as authorized by the deep history of Marxism. So we would talk about correspondence between Marx and Engels as a platypus moment, or we would talk about the role of revolutionary Marxism as akin to platypus, but perhaps most poignantly, we would look at Trotsky and Trotskyism and the Frankfurt School as anticipating our project, which is why I think the platypus synthesis is being quoted in the panel prompt for today. And there is no formula. I should say that, despite my view that we should continue, it's now, as at the founding of Platypus, we have no formula or recipe for conjuring the left into existence. Nevertheless, and I also want to say that in many ways the situation is more degraded than it was for our precursors, the Frankfurt School and Trotskyism. Certainly, unlike Adorno and the older representatives that the name Frankfurt School has come to designate, as Adorno puts it in Resignation, we provide something like the cadre education that is otherwise unavailable on the left. So coupled with with our activity hosting the conversation is our pedagogy, where we teach the classics of Marxism. We teach the syllabus that would be taught by a Marxist organization. Right? The core of what we teach is a syllabus that's handed to us by the history of Marxism, whether it's the Marx that we read, or the Lenin, or the Luxemburg, or the Trotsky. These are texts that we don't select because we like them. We select them because they express the project of Marxism that currently is historically dissolved, disintegrated. So no doubt, while the reconstitution of the left will require a great deal of strategic and tactical thinking, Platypus addresses what we might term the spiritual impasse in history. We want to raise the red banner in history. We want to raise the tattered flag, the tattered red flag of socialism. And yet all we can do is, in a sense, attempt to bring that flag into focus, bring what it once meant historically and what its initial hoisting once meant. When Adorno defends reflection in the late 1960s, he's holding on to the legacy of Marxism. And in an important sense, Marxists never did anything but reflect. There was certainly a workers' movement for socialism in history, and it was not without its intellectuals, to be sure. But Marxism represents the height of that intellectual participation in socialism, the height of socialism's self-consciousness. And that's what Platypus focuses on, what in the history of Marxism is called the subjective factor in history and its self-clarification. That, we argue, is above all the obstacle to the reconstitution of the left, is the degradation of the consciousness of Marxism. So one way I might put this in a pedagogical voice is if there threatens in a reading group discussion, or if you guys teaching a reading group try to fill in the context, right? My comment on that is always, yes, but the most fundamental thing about the context is the text, is the fact that this could be thought. That's a fundamental fact about history, right? And one that accumulates through regression. We can't, in other words, that subjective fact in history has accumulated into the present through regression. And it's our task to clear the obstacles and, in a sense, trace that degradation of history. So in our reading group, we can, in a historicist vein, study what the Marxist left was. And we do that, inevitably. It's necessary for ourselves, as, so to speak, historians, to identify what the left was and what it did, how it organized, and how it operated. But this is inevitably one-sided. To get at the past, ultimately, we have to trace the path back to it, which is to say we have to discover how those pathways are blocked or washed away. Just want to say a few things about the background to this panel and this convention, some of which I think were anticipated last night by Chris. Chris said last night, I don't know if I'm going to be able to write the way that I have written for 18 years. I don't know if the left motivates me anymore to write for the Platypus Review in the way that the left has. And he said, I don't want to, I can't be motivated by these rad libs and by this degraded Maoism, right? And it really, of course Chris isn't abdicating his responsibilities in Platypus, but I do think that he is indicating the way in which Platypus, certainly, and I think Laurie's already anticipating this, is placed under a certain stress, and how this project is really, its viability is dependent upon younger generations. Chris, first of all, I expect you guys to write for the Platypus Review and to find a motivation in these degraded rad libs and this degraded Maoism, this, I think he called it cargo cult Marxism, that perhaps he doesn't have the patience to do. Perhaps the only way to do that is through an appropriation of the history of Platypus, right? The fundamental difference for the young members in this meeting who think about what we were 17 years ago, 18 years ago at our founding, is that there's 160 plus issues of the PR. There are these books in the back that seem very heavy, formidable, might take weeks to read, right? That what it means to, that in and through your activity of hosting the conversation on the left, you're going to be driven back to the immediate history of our organization, and that history, of course, can't sit there like a dead weight on a shelf, but has to be reanimated in and through your activity. that you're driven back to think about why is the left the way that it is today? How did the millennial left further degrade conditions on the left, right? That it's not just a kind of upturn, downturn, but that the history that we've lived through has actively further disorganized the memory of Marxism, right? That it's propelled regression. And Platypus as an organization is an entree into reflecting upon that. That's enough for me for now.
So Richard next.
Hello. The prompt for this mentioned the platypus synthesis, and I, of course, was one of the participants in that. And I spoke on the ambiguities of platypus. And it's largely in thinking about the intervening time and the meaning of the ambiguity of platypus as a project. And in that spirit that I made some prepared remarks. I wrote them basically on the flight here last night. And I'm going to read them. I was told that they were supposed to be about 5 minutes. They're going to be somewhat longer than that. Oh, sorry.
Don't need that.
I
can hold it for you.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
Take all the time you need. There's no limit.
The word dialectics is perhaps the most used and abused word in the Marxist lexicon. I am, as many of you know, not fond of it and avoid it as much as possible, because for the most part, its use seems to me to lead to a lazy and obfuscatory jargon. Nevertheless, it is well worth considering its origins in antiquity. That is not the familiar Hegelian dialectics, but rather its Platonic ancestor. Marx once described the Greeks as normal children, and in its Greek childhood, dialectics was still linked in deep etymological fashion to its sister dialogue. Pierre Hadot comments, according to the Republic, would-be philosophers should not practice dialectics until they have acquired a certain maturity. Once they reach this age, they should study it for 5 years, from age 30 to 35. In Plato's time, dialectics was a debating technique subject to precise rules. A thesis was proposed, and interrogative propositions such as, can virtue be taught? One of the two interlocutors attacked the thesis, the other defended it. The former attacked by interrogating, that is, he asked the defender skillfully chosen questions with the aim of forcing him to admit the contradictory of the thesis that he wanted to defend. The interrogator had no thesis, and this is why Socrates was in the habit of playing that role. As Aristotle says, Socrates always played the part of the interrogator and never that of the respondent, for he admitted that he knew nothing, sort of via negativa. Dialectics taught students not only how to attack, but also how to respond by avoiding the interrogator's traps. The discussion of a thesis was to constitute the principal form of teaching until the 1st century BCE. Training in dialectics was absolutely necessary insofar as Plato's disciples were destined to play a role in their city. In a civilization where political discourse was central, young people had to be trained to have a perfect mastery of speech and reasoning. Yet in Plato's eyes, such mastery was dangerous, for it risked making young people believe that any position could be either defended or attacked. That is why Platonic dialectics was not a purely logical exercise. Instead, it was a spiritual exercise which demanded that the interlocutors undergo an ascesis, or self-transformation. It was not a matter of combat between two individuals in which the more skillful person imposed his point of view, but a joint effort on the part of two interlocutors in accord with the rational demands of reasonable discourse or the logos. Opposing his method to that of contemporary heuristics, which practiced controversy for its own sake, Socrates says, when two friends like you and me are in the mood to chat, we have to go about it in a gentler and more dialectical way. By more dialectical, I mean not only that we give real responses, but we base our responses solely on what the interlocutor has admitted himself. And the word he uses actually in the Greek, I looked it up, is dialektoteron. A true dialogue is possible only if the interlocutors want to dialogue. Thanks to this agreement between the interlocutors, which is renewed at each stage of the discussion, neither of the interlocutors imposes his truth upon the other, On the contrary, dialogue teaches them to transcend their own point of view and to put themselves in each other's place. By dint of a sincere effort, the interlocutors discover by themselves and within themselves a truth which is independent of them insofar as they submit to the superior authority of the Logos. Here, as in all ancient philosophy, philosophy consists in the movement by which the individual transcends himself towards something which lies beyond him. Why then invoke this Platonic dialectic, not the familiar Hegelian one, in a conversation, a dialogue perhaps, about why Platypus seeks to host the conversation on the left? One answer is that it is an ideal which, even if not achievable, is nevertheless something that, quote, tasks, unquote, us. Certainly Platypus loves this verb to task. And that this task zieht uns hinan as the eternal feminine did Faust, whether we reach it or not. Another meaning is perhaps posed by my juxtaposition of the ancient meaning of dialectics with the modern Hegelian use of the term. For with regards to the latter, if the left is dead, then perhaps the dialectic is dead too, and all faith in history is called into question. If the crisis of Marxism seems to push Platypus back to a consideration of what we call radical bourgeois philosophy, so then the crisis of the Hegelian dialectic, perhaps, has pushed Platypus back into a postmodern version of the Platonic dialectic. If not philosophically, then at least as a pedagogical tool. Certainly the notion of hosting the conversation on the left would have struck people like Lenin and Trotsky as bizarre. The point was to polemicize against wrong positions and to establish correct ones in order to further the goal of world revolution. That we instead host the conversation is an acknowledgement on our part of the cumulative effect of world historic defeats over multiple generations that seem to us to have rendered such a direct, and let us say it clearly, such a, quote, positive, unquote, approach futile. The via negativa is not then an ideal, but rather a consolation prize for world historical defeats that make Marxism absurd. Credo quia absurdum. Finally, let me offer the most mundane and perhaps cynical explanation. To use an analogy that I've used previously, it is for obvious reasons impossible to sail directly against the wind. It is, however, quite possible, as sailors know, to do this by tacking, using a zigzag motion in which the wind's energy itself is used to go against the direction of the wind. The ideological headwinds that Platypus faces are very strong. Sailing directly against them is impossible, but perhaps an indirect approach, using the wind's own energy to go against itself, can achieve our goal. Here, hosting the conversation on the left is an historically specific tactic. It is not a principle, nor the raison d'etre of Platypus. As a tactic, the question of its long-term viability must be raised. In the past, when I have raised these questions, I have been falsely accused of liquidationism. So let me be very clear about what I am saying. I am not saying that Platypus should stop putting on panels. What I am saying is that Platypus needs to think more carefully about the automatic impulse to put panels on as a response to something happening on the left. Was putting on all the Israel-Palestine panels, for example, since October 7th, really worthwhile? Was there not another way of engaging this suddenly popular topic? There are two fundamental issues with regard to hosting the conversation that should be considered. The first problem, of course, is the tension between our guests from the left, whom we are hosting, and the internal voice of Platypus pedagogy, which is masked by our role as hosts. Hence the typical terrible Platypus questions asked of panelists by our members, which feel more about our members trying to feel that they have mastered the Platypus pedagogy and language, rather than about provoking an interesting response. Indeed, these typical Platypus questions are usually not understood, misunderstood, or simply ignored by the panelists. Another problem is that in the post-game analysis of the panels, the analysis of it, whether in private conversations or on the list, tends simply to reduce the panelists to a collection of symptoms, which are to be identified and cataloged, as though we are the entomologists and not the psychoanalysts of the left. Is the point of hosting the conversation, then, to simply stage a ghoulish play acted out by zombies who do not recognize that they are the undead? Is this really pedagogically useful? If so, for whom? Ideally, hosting the conversation should make our own members and contacts think about the conversation they are listening to, and not merely confirm what they already know, namely that, quote, the left is dead, unquote. Perhaps this happens occasionally, no doubt more frequently with newer people, but it happens far too rarely. The second problem is the specific historical context of the conversation that we are trying to host. Although the sacred dates for Platypus are 1848 and 1917, the conversation that we are hosting is inevitably about what Hobsbawm called the short 20th century from 1914 to 1991. But the conversation takes place after that short century, quote, short century, unquote, ended, and increasingly the participants are people who were not even born when it ended. Because the period which followed it has produced no new ideas, we live in a world of old ideas that are served up to younger and younger people in ever more garbled and vulgar forms. When baby boomers who were veterans of the New Left could make up a significant portion of our panelists, we could perhaps expect a certain engagement with the earlier history of the 20th century. 1968 was, after all, closer in time to 1917 than it is to the present. One can, of course, always host some conversation, but not all conversations are of genuine interest or pedagogical value. Hosting the conversation of entirely Zoomer panels and ultimately Generation Alpha, etc., will, I fear, probably not have the same potential to cause even a tiny crack in an entrenched leftist discourse. One must face this problem soberly. The point is not to immediately jump the tripod, but to ask in what ways it can, in the long term, be supplemented and transformed. Perhaps I am too pessimistic, but the real issue is not my assessment of the present or the pace of transformation, but whether I have judged correctly the evolution of a tendency. I realize that in posing these questions this way, I'm asking Platypus members to do something unfamiliar and, I fear, anxiety-provoking. That is, to take the concept of doing Platypus not as a fixed set of principles that we can learn once and for all and then constantly aspire to do, but as an evolving historical project that is constantly struggling with its own relationship to history. To genuinely aspire to host a conversation on the left is, however, the attempt to link the beginning and end of the history of dialectics, in its ancient form as dialogue, and in its modern form as history, like an Ouroboros swallowing its tail.
Okay, that's the right distance. At this moment, it is unclear what to do and how to continue. But how did we get here? I'd like to offer two accounts. Both are older than 10 years by now. The first one is from Andrew Feenberg, speaking on our panel, Politics of Critical Theory, from 2011. I quote, "We still live under the horizon of progressive politics established by the New Left. Its issues are still ours, although of course transformed in many ways by time. But the most significant impact of the New Left is on our identity as leftists. The New Left invented a non-sectarian form of progressive opposition that defines the stance of most people on the left today." End quote. The second account is by Bhaskar Sunkara, taken from the panel, and I mean the Platypus panel, Conversations on the Left, What is to be Done, from 2013. I quote, "I think there is an opportunity for a formation like the Left Party in Germany." So Bhaskar is talking about the opportunity of forming something like the Left Party, Die Linke, in the United States in 2013. Which I'm sure neither of you has much faith in, but which would present an opening for the radical left, which historically has been symbiotic or parasitic on broader reformist workers' movements. I think these developments can open up new political possibilities. Even with American liberalism today, we can identify two different camps. We can see liberals committed to this New Deal coalition, and we have liberals who are technocratic or deep into third-way politics. The technocratic liberals are, in a sense, more sophisticated in that they actually saw the crisis of the American welfare state in the 1970s and saw the crisis of the broader central left. They actually adapted their program to this crisis. This gap between these main factions of what used to be the American central left presents political opportunities that might not even come close to emancipatory politics in our generation, but could still provide the terrain in which the left can regroup build itself institutionally and become a leading element in a broader center-left anti-austerity movement, thus opening up possibilities for politics in the future. End of quote. Well, the future is now. It was Trump who advances the crisis of the New Deal coalition politically, and Sarah Wagenknecht who advanced the crisis of the Linksparty, of the Party Die Linke in Germany. Where are we going? What about post-neoliberalism? The term itself was coined by the so-called pink tide in Latin America 30 years ago already, signaling different and more direct state intervention in the economy, nationalization of production, and the expanding of welfare state benefits. But what about conceptualizing it as neo-postmodernism, or rather postmodern progressivism? Both terms are certainly equally strange and cumbersome. After all, the left now is using the Heideggerian category of Dasein to understand, for example, why the consciousness of the peasantry is revolutionary. I'm referring to the interview with Hazaldin in the February issue of the PR. Another instance, a young upcoming academic teaching at the Business University in Vienna is currently dazzling our members who study there. This teacher, who, as I learned recently from our members there, bemoaned that she already lost too many bright young women to Marxism, wrote a paper about political economy to be conceptualized as a Wittgensteinian language game. She argues for modern monetary theory as the justification for the politicization of money via the postmodern conception of language. She wants back the primacy of politics as the primacy of the signifier. Post-neoliberalism, indeed. What the issue is here, in my opinion, and what I would like to put up for debate as the fundamental condition of our moment, is the complete and utter naturalization of post-politics coming out of the death of the millennial left. The present is not just a repetition of the 70s, but in my opinion, at least as much a repetition of the 80s and 90s, right up to its culmination in the Battle of Seattle. In the present, the left seems to have rejected the category of becoming and instead throws its weight on being. Hence, we might say, invoking the language of David Harvey's The Condition of Postmodernity, which was published in 1990, the left is rejecting time, its history, in favor of space, geography. Or more particularly, the left is rejecting time in favor of place. In other words, in favor of place. This might offer another way to look at the left's current obsession with nationalism, or rather localism, or what a recent Financial Times article has termed identity geopolitics. In other words, to come back to Feinberg's formulation, the progressive opposition that defines the stance of most people on the left today, invented by the new left, is changing. I recently caught myself wishing that Christopher Hitchens was still alive.
Actually.
To the question of how this affects Platypus. On the Platypus panel of 2018, it's called The History of the Platypus Critique. I can strongly recommend this panel. Someone in the audience asked what Platypus has forgotten about itself. That person in the audience mentioned that Platypus once said, "revolution in 2017." And that person implied that the organization was suppressing that or repressing that since at that moment it was already 2018. Platypus member Ed Remus, who spoke on that panel, gave a response that is still haunting me today. He said, and I quote, "We did, in a sense, witness revolution in 2017. In the sense of capitalist revolution, or arguably bourgeois revolution in capitalist form. That relates to the question of the nature of politics in society, because through a Platypus education, we can understand how Trump signals both revolution and conservatism, how neoliberalism, likewise in its time, was revolutionary and conservative, how Keynesian Fordism was likewise in its time revolutionary and conservative, how Wilson progressivism was likewise revolutionary and conservative. This gets at something that we are trying to work through in our project in a way that I don't see much of the rest of the left working through, end of quote. So I was just quoting at Renaissance Town. In that sense, the title of this year's conference could not be more to the point. What is left after Trump? After all, one could argue that Hamas's political fate was sealed not on 10/7/2023, but on September 15, 2020, the day the Abraham Accords were signed. Internally, I think we are still in what has been called the crisis of Joe's presidency 2019, where the initiatives to turn Platypus into an NGO have stricter membership criteria and a new constitution were voted down by the membership. A lot of the insecurity about whether we can still do Platypus, whether we can still learn from the left, or whether Platypus is repressing its earlier hopes by doubling down on doing Platypus, and thus is just going through the motions. All of these concerns are in my mind connected to the convention in 2019, which is also the first convention I ever attended. What I find puzzling about these concerns, which I do share very strongly, is that they almost seem like the concerns of a neurotic struggling to accept a decision he has already made but not fully understood yet. There were serious suggestions on the table back then for how to transform Platypus, but the membership decided against them. And I am not saying that we shouldn't revisit these suggestions on how to transform Platypus, but first we need to understand what the membership has already decided back then. We have already decided neither to transform our organization into something else, nor to close up shop. We have decided to go on. But the recognition of this and the reasons for it were severely hindered by a couple of factors. First of all, by the COVID-19 pandemic, which in a bizarrely accurate postmodern way laid the groundwork for transforming what David Harvey emphasized as the, quote, spatial and temporal form of the crisis of Fordism, end quote. Also, it is exactly in this period that we have grown significantly as an organization over the last 4 years. And by the way, I really do think Platypus is attracting the best of what the Zoomers have to offer. At the same time, it is clear to me that Platypus could not have been founded today. Instead, our, dare I say, younger members task us continually to teach them. What if the last 17 years and the over 160 issues of the PR and the podcast and the countless panels, etc., had only been in preparation for what is to come? What if Platypus is a self-overcoming of the millennial left, to borrow a formulation from Pat's recent teaching? At the same time, these questions are the result of a historical moment, our moment, that throws our work of the past 17 years into question.
Andreas, you're at 10 minutes.
Okay, it's 2 paragraphs. That's
Okay,
right.
okay.
If Platypus has failed, it seems plausible to me that the moment of its failure lies rather with the election of Obama in 2008 than with the death of the millennial left in 2017. My point is that it seems like at this moment nobody really has a clue where our work is going and what the future holds for Platypus. It is, however, not through the categories of success or failure that we'll find the clarity we are looking for, but only through recognizing the genesis of the opaqueness of our present. I do believe that we are at the beginning of a transformation which, like Wilsonian progressivism, Keynesian Fordism, neoliberalism, will both be revolutionary and conservative. Whether you want to call it post-neoliberalism or neo-postmodernism, which are completely insane and obscure terms, it is my opinion that these are the conditions under which we are currently laying the groundwork for our next decade. I do think that we now have to reckon with the fact that we have survived the death of the millennial left, whether we want to or not. I can't shake the impression that we have already decided on what to do, that we have already decided to continue, but maybe haven't understood the reasons for it yet. So maybe we haven't decided at all yet. But whether we want to or not, more is still to come. In the aftermath of the failed revolution of 1848, which David Harvey called the crisis of representation, French novelist Gustave Flaubert wrote, and I quote, "The thought of the future torments us, and the past is holding us back. That is why the present is slipping from our grasp." Thanks.
Hi. Minor observation that I think is interesting. Everyone on the panel here is wearing glasses. And also everyone on this panel is going to go over time. So my comments here are going to perhaps seem very abstract, and I just want to sort of preface it by saying that the considerations I made when writing these are very deeply motivated by my own activity at the Northwestern chapter, and I hope that members that I've engaged with at conventions, but also just in our overall Chicago activity, can validate that. I began participating in Platypus during my first year of undergrad in 2021. I was recruited properly into the membership by the end of that year, and ever since then, the question looming over me has been what the hell I've gotten myself into. I may sound like I joke, but I do mean it seriously. I've been told that Platypus is not esoteric. That is both true and untrue. Yes, there is nothing in Platypus that is intentionally hidden or obscure. What we do corresponds to what we want. There is no obfuscation, deception, or anything like that separating our inward and outward activity. Still, what Platypus actually is, the logic behind our orientation, methods, and self-conceived horizons of possibility, can't be easily swallowed. Platypus still appears opaque to a certain extent, even to ourselves, and perhaps that's necessarily the case. A successful recruitment into Platypus means understanding the edifice which you are tasked with building upon, but that is not the same as knowing the blueprints for the final product or the sturdiness of what's already been built. The negative character of our project means a perpetual risk of ossifying our own activity. Our activity becomes ritual rather than practice, even if it is already pseudo-practice given the death of the left. I can certainly picture a future in which we eternally strive towards our operational objective, the breakdown of the existing left, its pseudo-politics, and the miseducation it propagates, without actually transforming the world. One might attribute this anxiety to the political conditions prefiguring my entry into the Platypus, given that I was recruited in the throes of the so-called sixth phase. That alone can't explain the whole picture, though, as there are more members than myself who fear that the present conditions for Platypus are here to stay. I point, for example, to the increasing uncertainty about the adequacy of our use of phases as a framework for digesting Platypus's relationship to the left in the first place. At the inception of Platypus, upturns and downturns characterized the horizons of possibility, and therefore the possible activity and orientation which Platypus could adopt to navigate the ebbs and flows of the left. This understanding appears increasingly dubious today. The left's current downturn is protracted and intense. Is this not a boon for Platypus, though? Don't we want the left to disintegrate? Yeah, of course. But that is progress only if such a disintegration opens up the possibility for reflection, for new activity stimulated by true thought, informed by history, and capable of digesting it through means other than rote repetition. The collapse of the neo-social democratic movement, however, has not opened up opportunity for reflection. Rather, it has likely impeded the possibility for thought on the left, even more extremely. Chris's remarks yesterday about his profound ambivalence of engaging with Zoomer Stalinism and Maoism points to this exact problem. People think less than before. That makes it harder for us. This means that Platypus thus far has been falsified. If the left transforms in waves of growth and atrophy, then each wave we live through is another indication that our project may very well be inadequate. What can that tell us, though? The answer depends on the nature of the inadequacy. It would be dogmatic to deny the possibility that Platypus could have been hopeless from the start. It is a real and grim possibility. The left is dead, we're stuck in barbarism, and the last real opportunity to get out was, at best, 50 years ago. Alternatively, maybe our problem is purely quantitative. Our organization needs to be more robust for us to succeed, and so growing Platypus must be a prior consideration. If we grow more, we can capture the left more effectively. This could be a necessary prerequisite for Platypus to begin appearing as though it is succeeding, whatever that means. Another possibility may be that the meaning of our activity and the infrastructure which enables it has become obscure to ourselves. That is, we still reproduce platypus in form, while peering beneath the veil reveals that our project veers on the vacuous and idiosyncratic. The first two of these possibilities signify the extreme ends of politicization. The former reflects a profound depoliticization, that platypus is hopeless, while the latter reflects a sort of opportunism, that one must continue to do platypus for platypus' sake. This last possibility, however, is more nuanced. I also think it is a better description of the challenge that we actually face today. It is both the most and least desirable problem we could be facing. If our activity is becoming obscure to ourselves, it means that we do have a chance to reorient, or if we can recognize it at least, it gives the opportunity to reorient, to still prove the possibility and necessity of our activity. However, if we fail to grasp our purpose and the means by which we are to accomplish it, the platypus has faded to decay, becoming another remnant which some future project will be tasked with eventually overcoming. I guess I used task and Richard. What is at risk of obfuscation? Platypus hosts the conversation on the left. Our tripod exists to facilitate that goal instrumentally. Many gripe that leading with the reading group indicates organizational stagnation, or the threat of it. That we teeter on becoming a gaggle of overly intellectual academics, who are simply interested in being better than the rest of the left, which ultimately replaces the desire to actually transform it. Such a crisis of the reading group reflects at the same time the reading group's necessity. The reading group syllabus is, of course, our organization's fundamental tool for working through the left's miseducation. In contrast, leading with our fora seems more desirable. It more adequately reflects the sort of invention that Platypus aims to accomplish. I say we ought to consider the same risk that we read into our reading group. Simply conducting fora could ultimately supplant our desire to make something of them. When we say Platypus hosts the conversation on the left, we mean that our fora enable discussion that would not otherwise occur. Hosting the conversation is not enough, though. Our fora seek to translate the left's own accumulated memory into a potent force for its self-transformation. That may be through destruction. Successfully hosting the conversation means we are capable of motivating why we host the conversation on the left in the first place. But even more importantly, that we can justify the character of the conversation we host. If nobody outside of Platypus can grasp our activity, then we may have curated an 18-year-long conversation with no point. Platypus hosts the conversation on the left because nobody else will. It is necessary to make as explicit as possible the failures, inadequacies, and inertia of the present left. But we are also incapable of imagining what might take the present left's place once the field is cleared. If we could imagine a future left, that would mean that Platypus must become political. In lieu of this missing piece, we are tasked with a negative project. Clear away the detritus, liquidate the left, or make it liquidate itself, and preserve the memory of what Marxism was so it can be captured by some future project. We have to host the conversation to show that the conversation has already been had. I lost my track. It has already been had, but without Platypus, the left's legacy manifests only in fragmented and ambiguous ways, flitting by before it can be apprehended and oriented toward further learning. Our goal is to make the simultaneously informative and inadequate lessons of the past explicit to the utmost extent. That's the only way they can be digested. Who are we making this historical memory explicit for? Adorno and Horkheimer concluded that there was no subject to appropriate a new manifesto, and that their theory must therefore serve as a message in a bottle. We need to ask ourselves for whom we do Platypus. Maybe it is for Platypus itself, a permanent monastic dedication to developing a project which will never be realized but is always correct. It is certainly not our panelists, as they are the least malleable component of our activity. Platypus certainly cannot, and does not intend to, change their convictions. We really engage with the left's symptoms in order to reveal the present crisis to those on the verge of entering it. That is, the future left. We must recognize that there is a third party involved in our activity, represented neither by Platypus nor the left which we force to speak on our panels. The yet-to-be-educated left is our primary audience. An important conclusion follows. Platypus is capable of hosting the conversation because we recognize that all of the left has something to say, even if they are all wrong and all right. At the same time, we do not have the answers to its failures, only the questions necessary to extract reflections out of our begrudging speakers. That means we need to ask the right questions for our fora to matter. There's a critical difference between internal and external Platypus questions, and I think Richard's comments alluded a little bit to this. The two serve different functions. The phrase telescoping is rather helpful here. Within Platypus, we have a massive archive, which is now insurmountable for any single member, plain and simple. In lieu of this, we require an organizational transfer of knowledge across its generations, and therefore a certain amount of telescoping, that is, taking for granted certain comprehension of points of interest on the basis of a presumed shared language. This is why we recruit members only after they've gone through the reading group syllabus. Internal discussions are relegated to our listserv and teach-ins. Teach-ins are also internal in the sense that these events are fundamentally Platypus members speaking to Platypus members. We take for granted key assumptions, which we may not be able to take for granted among the rest of the left. Namely, the content of real historical Marxism, our thesis of historical regression, and the dead character of the left today. What I want to encourage our membership to reflect upon is the risk of our external activity inappropriately presupposing our internal content in front of the wrong audience. A way I have phrased this previously is whacking our speakers on the head with our syllabus, which is a comment I'd actually made about last year's convention. This may seem to contradict my statement earlier that Platypus has no esoterica. After all, if we are honest about our activity, why ought we distinguish internal from external? The reason is rather simple. Hosting the conversation on the left is only the first step. The second step is producing mutually intelligible ground for different systems of the left to play off of each other. Our questions need to make sense and take nothing for granted. We put so much question or consideration into triangulation because we want a conversation, not a series of lectures and discrete questions and answers equivalent to separate presentations in linear order. A successful panel employs questions capable of uncovering otherwise hidden affinities and dissonances between our panelists. But these relationships ought to manifest in the patient. The doctor can't simply assert them. If we treat panels as an opportunity to simply try the left for its crimes, then we're doomed. To students of the future left, still vulnerable to miseducation, Platypus will appear as nothing other than an overly intellectual sectarian organization. In fact, we are, but critical consciousness of our sectarian character means that we carefully mediate between our relationship to the history of the left and the way we seek to change it. We need to be careful with what we ask, ensuring that the left concedes its own pathologies, not through cross-examination, but through its own free association. What can be done to fix this? I feel uncomfortable insinuating that the only way that Platypus can preserve itself is some sort of deranged methodological struggle session. Instead, I encourage membership to revitalize its efforts to engage with the left outside of Platypus. And I don't mean outside of Platypus as like individuals, but outside of Platypus as like a space. We want to learn. That's what makes us different. Go to the left and bring your contacts. Our confidence in the necessity of hosting the conversation comes from experiencing how the left functions in our conversation's absence. That conversation's success depends upon our honest desire to learn from the left. We will continue to host panels. The left will continue to grip to its confessions as though its life depends on it. They are correct about that. They will be kicking and screaming as we try to pull them to campus. We must therefore prove to them that we are who we say we are, that they actually have an audience, and that we see them as more than zoo animals or a left equivalent of suspiciously German Argentines. Earnestly learn from the left on their turf so that we can get them on ours. And that's not just to get them on our panels, but to understand what our panels are actually for in the first place. It's difficult to be right, and it's nearly impossible for being right to matter.
So we're gonna have the panelists respond to each other. We're a little over halfway through our allotted time for this room, so I don't want to rush anybody. Say what you want to say, and I guess we'll just stick in this room as long as we can, and hopefully we can get through at least some questions. So yeah, let's get started.
I think half an hour break would still be good before whatever's next, at least.
Yeah, I think it's more a matter of getting kicked out. So.
Well, if no one else is going to be in. So I want to respond to Lori. So I don't think that hosting the conversation is the raison d'etre of Platypus. Again, I emphasize it's essentially tactical character. It's a central tactic, but it's not. The raison d'etre of Platypus is overcoming regression. It is the classical goal of Marxism, which is world revolution and rebuilding a socialist movement. Now, from its inception, that goal has always seemed a highly unlikely one to achieve. In other words, it's always been clear to me that Platypus is a project that will almost certainly fail. That doesn't mean one doesn't make one's best effort, because one is tasked by it, and it gives one other reward. So, when again these charges of liquidation were raised against me, I would say that, please do not misunderstand, I'm not saying we should stop hosting panels. We need to stop thinking about panels what seems to me in this mechanical way. And we also need to think about the ways in which, when one hosts a conversation, one is trying to push the conversation in particular ways. We don't just host the conversation. We are not naive hosts. There is an element, if you want to put it that way, just as there is in the reading group, of pushing certain ideas. I think that there is going to be a diminishing benefit over the long term. The analogy would be something like the tendency of the falling rate of profit. The profit rates are not going to necessarily fall, or climate change, or something like that. But the question is there a long-term tendency where that tendency overweighs the counter tendencies? I think there is, and I think that the people who are thinking about Platypus, both the membership and the leadership, have to think about the long-term structure of the tripod, and they have to think not of abolishing the tripod, not of abandoning it, but of supplementing it. And they have to think about the ways in which this idea that, that positive pedagogy, so, Spencer's point about, providing people with a college education. I think that a lot of what people in Platypus often need is a kind of teaching of history. I think it's a problem in the reading group that people encounter texts that assume historical background knowledge. And I think in some ways we need to think about how can we teach history? How can we introduce people to general philosophical concepts that are alluded to by various texts? I would also say that the question of hosting the conversation is connected to the internal conversation in Platypus. It's very much connected. And the question of whether there are disagreements, what the nature of those disagreements is, and the way that people in Platypus may have fundamentally different interpretations and visions of what Platypus is about.
Thanks, everyone.
Can I respond?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. I think that tactics might be a little limiting in terms of the grand scope of what our task is. I think that it is a matter of means and ends, however. And those ends, yes, long term, we want to see the overcoming of capitalism and socialism and emancipatory politics that will lead us there. No doubt, but we are dealing with a sort of different kind of future that we're imagining, which is the dissolving of ideological obstacles, right? And of course, it's one of those terms that we repeat all the time, and we have to think about what that means. A good example for me was actually talking to Jim Kalberg last convention about his engagements with the Socialist Party, and he talked about explicitly like the ways in like trying to get anything done at the Socialist Party. It was like constantly being blocked, and couldn't move forward in a basic like campaign for like rent, supporting like rent control or something of the like. But that there was like clear symptomology that you experience when you're trying to do some sort of activism around the left that sort of like can become crystallized in those engagements, that then Platypus is hosting the conversation of multiple natures about the left, has to kind of pursue not changing the left as it is now, but how the next generation might be able to think about the left and the potentiality in history. And so the question of going positive, I also kind of like want to put a finer point on, because I think that one of the most like exemplary examples was the American Revolution lecture series. But we have to recognize that it was also motivated by a particular like 1619 project, but the broader ideological questions being raised around Black Lives Matter, and that it wasn't necessary. Like I would consider not just thinking about that as positive history, but thinking about Kolakowski, right? How it was actually an educational step in trying to negate existing reality, right? So itself would have not happened without Platypus, without finding and seeing the limitations of the current left with regards to the American Revolution. So it's not necessarily, or at least it might be dialectically, related in terms of positive and negative and the tension there between the positive and negative education that we're posing. I do think that dissolving ideological obstacles, how we come to really see that task, what it might mean. Like, I feel like sometimes we really do need to flesh that one out a bit more as a goal, and the hosting the conversation as a means to that particular and very specifically defined goal. No.
Yeah, well, thanks everyone. I'd like to build on a couple of points and say two things. First of all, I think in a period of growth like we've experienced the last couple of years, there is one very important thing to keep in mind, especially in a time that is as deeply nihilistic as this time, our time, and that is individuals matter. What I mean by this is really the fact that there is a non-identity between your own thinking and Platypus. Platypus doesn't give you a Weltanschauung. Platypus doesn't give you, any kind of sense of ideological identity, but raises questions. So I do want to stress very strongly the need for you to struggle, not struggle is the wrong word, but the need to grapple with what you are learning in the real world, because that's almost impossible. That's a task which is, it's gonna make you crazy if you don't, have a very, stable psychological background and help. So, psychotherapy and going to the gym. No, but seriously, my point I'm trying to make is that individuals matter in that sense, the non-identity between Platypus and what you are going to do with the stuff in the world. Like that's to me a deciding factor. And that's something that lies outside of what Platypus can discuss. And I'm very aware of that, but nonetheless, I think it's really, really important for you, like each one of you individually, to think about what you're going to do with this education, what you're going to do with the questions we raised, and especially, that's the second point, at this moment in time, because I do think that we are at the beginning, like I said, of a transformation of what David Harvey called I think it's a regime of accumulation, which will change our perspective, which will change this sort of presupposed, completely naturalized, non-sectarian form of progressive opposition that the New Left invented, and that makes this term being a leftist, or that makes the term the left in this, and I hate to use it, but it's almost too perfect vibe.
Yeah. I really appreciated the comments of all my other panelists. And I want to take up a couple of points that they raised. Specifically, I want to take up this question of supplementing the tripod and how that arises out of our own history. One of the things that I've been arguing in Platypus is that our own history has transformed us, and that I think Andreas was really attentive to the question of the history of Platypus in a way that I know a lot of the stuff has sounded for a long time very perhaps precious or unmotivated, talking about phases of history that we've lived through, how we've curated the conversation over time, the question of, which is very much in the Orcom report, the different ways that we conceptualize the temporalities of our time. I think that the tripod, or if we focus it on doing forum, there is a question of how it could become a kind of pseudo-activity or a rote activity. Richard raised this specter. We've long talked about the way that our fora are not simply events in one moment of time, but we have to think about what we're doing in advance. We need committees for those fora. We can't have one member put these things together and then they just appear and nobody knows how. Obviously, the way that our activity takes place is never going to be equally shared as experienced by all members, but certain members, committee members, chapters are going to be more involved. We think about the kinds of questions that we're going to ask. We can be disappointed in those questions, as again, Richard raised. We also have the accumulated experience of how can we reflect further on these. We publish transcripts, etc. But beyond that, our activity raises the history of our activity. And that weighs much more, that is, as it were, a dimension of the tripod that wasn't there in the same way when we hosted the panel on imperialism 17 years ago. Right, and so this is why I pointed to these sick books and this accumulation of PRs, etc. How can it be motivated through present activity, through putting on fora, through pursuing your own interests on the left, young people, pursuing your own interests on the left, and that projects out of that activity in the present the history of Platypus, both in the form of other members, right, in the form of teachers that you can find, people who put on panels in the past, people who've reflected on these issues before, maybe mentors that you were simply assigned, who can either talk to you about their experience of doing Platypus in the past, or can refer you to other members. Right? This is what our organization exists for. So our organization and our activity is transformed in and through our activity, and not just in even in an accumulation of a declining rate of profit sense, right? But in non-linear ways. And that's why we talk about these things like phases, right? We talk about it in terms of historical accumulation. That's, of course, related to something like the way that the crisis of capitalism accumulates through the declining rate of profit. But the declining rate of profit is always mitigated by all sorts of other factors. Right? It's phenomenal, right? We try to grasp, as it were, history more on the analogy of the accumulation of capital, right? The non-linearity of that, right? So I wanted to say that, and I did want to raise, there was one point where Richard and I simply disagree, and I wanted to mention, which is that I don't think that Marxists established correct positions. Right? I think that we are authorized by the history of Marxism in the sense that we read Lukács, that Marxism is about historical consciousness, right? And I think that, you know, it's very hard to understand Trotsky and Lenin and Luxemburg as simply arguing for correct positions, right? I don't see how I could teach left-wing communism and infantile disorder. Is that just about, you know, entry into unions, into, you know, to base bourgeois, you know, institutions in society, or is that about the history of Bolshevism? Right? What does that mean? What does retreat mean? What is the preservation of historical consciousness, or even the deepening of historical consciousness through defeat? I know that Richard knows this, but I simply wanted to mark that for younger students, that even the way that political mass party Marxism, of course, was engaged in struggles over strategy and tactics. Ultimately, Marxism, and this is what I was trying to highlight, is simply about reflection, and reflection on what? A reflection on history. And that's where I think ultimately the question becomes, in terms of the viability of Platypus, is Platypus activity still a way for students to experience the passage of time as historical? Right? Is it possible to learn from our own time? And I strongly endorse the comments I think Andreas just made about what does it mean to be able to take your platypus education into the world beyond platypus. That's all I'll say for now.
So, start with one.
Ben hasn't
Yeah.
said anything.
I wanted to respond.
I think Richard can respond first since Spencer made
Okay. Had a direct response to this question. So one thing that I would strongly agree with Spencer is the decline in the sense of historical time. I think that's often strikes me in ways that are shocking when I see how much there has been this decline, even in the last few decades. And the other thing is I do disagree about the point about an earlier Marxism. I think in earlier Marxism, a lot of the texts we read are polemical. That it's not about hosting a conversation between Lenin and the left communists. It's about one side feeling that it's right, the other side feeling it's wrong. We in Platypus may feel that both Lenin and Kautsky have good points, or that there's some point in holding a conversation between them. Kautsky and Lenin themselves, after their break, certainly did not. I mean, I guess another question, and thinking, listening.
Right and wrong about what?
Well, about whatever the political issue was. I mean, in other words, Lenin thought that his political opponents were wrong, and that a lot of the arguments that we read are about saying, I'm right and you're wrong, and this is why. That's not what Platypus does. We're not taking positions in that way, and hosting the conversation is by definition not doing that. I mean, I do want to ask a pedagogical question, and this is directly raised Spencer. So, I guess there's Stefan's German language pedagogues call, which I have never listened to, but I've listened to your pedagogues calls, and of course I participate regularly on Chris's. Now, the two are very different in style. Yours are monologic and pedagogical in a normal, and in many ways, more productive way. Because I'm there, and because I'm a participant, not an official pedagogue, there's inevitably a kind of Chris Richard conversation which meanders on the Chris pedagogues class. And some people have said they appreciate that, and other people, I think, have been frustrated by it. And I honestly am not sure which of those pedagogical structures works better. I think often your pedagogues' calls are better than Chris's, both because you don't wander as much and because I'm not there, making Chris wander even more.
Ben, did you have any comments?
Yeah, I suppose I'll tap on the tripod comments because I think that's interesting, and to a certain extent I worry that my comments ultimately really only touched on the question of why we host the conversation in a sort of tangential and peripheral way. I hope that wasn't the case. But with regard to the tripod, what I very specifically had hoped to point to at the end of my remarks is a way that we might be able to actually think through the question of how might we be able to practically, through organizational activity, actually come to conclusions about seemingly existing obstacles in Platypus and our capacity to conduct it. And so when others raise the tripod as this sort of instrumental supplement to the task of hosting the conversation, which itself is an instrumental method of working through the dead left, I think that it's very important to look at the tripod. And one thing that I've been thinking about lately, and I found this peculiar with the recent membership packet, is that the tripod is framed as the reading group, public fora, and the coffee break, where I don't actually know where I received this from, but I remember very distinctively hearing at one point that the third leg of the tripod is milieu building, and that the function of the tripod is very specifically predicated on the assumption that we have to be in touch with the left in a certain way. And I'm not saying that we have to be political or something like that, but rather that milieu building is not just a coffee break, that we understand where our contacts are and so that we can successfully get them into the cult, but rather that it also includes going to the left because there are fundamental differences in the ways that they self-conceive of their practices that might be obscure even to us, even if we're more capable of understanding it. And so the reason that I closed my remarks out and that I hope I can sort of connect with Andreas' point about sort of going outward with Platypus, if I'm understanding correctly, I hope, is that engaging with the left is also part of our activity. We don't simply have a monopoly on the conversation. And so what I think about, for example, that I found very interesting is, I forget where in Germany this was mentioned, but that Platypus is understood as just like a fixation, like it's there, it's a thing that exists. At the Eurocon, there was the mention that, I forget which panelist said it, but it's like Platypus is where you go to talk about when you fail. That's a problem. And with regard to the tripod, our participation on the left is dull-edged, but it's fundamentally necessary. I won't say more than that.
Questions?
Let's move on to questions.
All right, so we're gonna move on to questions. You can go hand this off to Tomas, and then after you're done, just kind of pass it along.
Why don't you guys keep that, Joe?
All right.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to know on formulation of the comic board, so the tension between being the last Marxist and hosting the conversation on the left. Because from my understanding, it's not the problem that there's a tension between these two things, but rather this tension is actually breaking down and somehow being just split up into two separate things. And I think we perceive this as just having a reading group where we learn the correct things, and on the other hand, doing panels by rote and just kind of looking at the most recent symptoms just because we can. And I think the question is how these two relate to each other. So I was wondering if all of you, I think you touched on this in certain ways, but whether the original necessity of feeling this tension between history as represented in the reading group and the present as represented by the left is still viable, how that could be kind of re-attempted, or whether we do that. And then maybe another one, within this formulation of us being the last Marxists, there's kind of a substitution for Chris's formulation of himself for the organization as such. And I wonder if the question of pedagogy and whether we're able to take up the task of self-education after Chris could be touched upon. It's obviously been about hosting the conversation in the fora, but I think in the background is the question of how we relate the reading group pedagogy to our public life, what the difference between the historical left and the present is.
I'd say that the question of Chris is fundamental to the future of Platypus. I mean, Chris plays a central role pedagogically. I think that, a way I would distinguish the sort of reading group pedagogy from the fora is to a large extent a kind of esoteric versus exoteric, more than necessarily the problem of Marxism or non-Marxism, because I'm not sure that the reading group is simply about Marxism. And again, I would really, really want to emphasize the point that Spencer raised about the decline in historical consciousness. And I don't know what can be done about it, but I think it's central to the way we think about Platypus and to the question of hosting the conversation. There's been a profound general cultural decline in historical consciousness, and it's a very, very deep, I'm tempted to say, spiritual problem, and it's an immense historical obstacle to any type of reconstitution of the left.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Thomas. I want to bring it back to a point I tried to raise in my opening remarks, because I'm sometimes a little bit frustrated with the conversation of whether we are still viable, whether we are just doing pseudo-activity and so on, because I've heard this a lot of time, and it's necessary to ask these questions, no doubt. It's the lifeblood of this organization, but I do feel sometimes that these questions are raised as like an end in itself. And so I want to make it more concrete historically. This is what I tried with my opening remarks, and nobody actually commented on 2019, on Joe's presidency. I don't know, I thought this is interesting because I really wanted to raise this as a point of discussion, as something, you know, that I wanted to see and test what others think about. You know, so just one last sentence. So in terms of whether we're still viable to host a conversation on the left, meaning have a productive tension between the reading group and public fora, you know, that goes back to me to that decision 2019, where it was a concrete decision about, you know, going on.
I just was to respond to the Joe's presidency because I was going to mention it. So I don't think that Joe's presidency was such a big crisis. I think it was a pseudo-crisis. I meant to say that. And I don't think that it was as significant as it appears for some reason in Platypus memory.
I also think it has a lot to do with like it being your first convention, which for anybody it's a shock no matter what. That one's first convention is a shock no matter what. So you can, meaning the thing is that 2016 was an inflection point, 2020 was an inflection point, and all of that period in between felt like a very intense inflection point of we do not know what's next, right? And yeah, Richard nodded, but I think that was a big thing of the open conversations during that time. And 2024, now it's another intensification of that inflection point that hasn't been resolved precisely because we now had like 4 years of Biden. I wanted to, before I pass it on to you, sorry.
Go nuts.
When I was really thinking about this and I wrote it, so I needed to go back to it, was kind of like, I kind of feel that like the tension question for me is kind of like, and like the spark that happens when like things just kind of like come together with the tripod, things just begin to like click, right? Sometimes what Platypus does is kind of like connect the dots, or the other term of it, like, you know, all these shards and fragments of the left, like we kind of like try to create like a crucible for them, right? Kind of make sense of that, and like in a way that it's perhaps a kind of historical consciousness, of course much regress from what it was before, but I really think that the big issue is the fear around feeling the weight of history in our shoulders. The fear that comes with making the absence of the left palpable, right? The absence of emancipatory palpable, right? And yeah, actually, it's Platypus in a way like really embodies a certain kind of experience of feeling the weight of history on your shoulders and a certain kind of responsibility, a tasking that creates, and sort of like, do we abdicate the responsibility that we've somehow come to recognize within our tripod educational organizational experience, or we try to find a way forward.
I'll try to be rather brief, and I want to answer Andreas' comments on the Joe presidency because I think I have a rather peculiar perspective on it, which is that I became a member in 2021. I can't recall all of the crises that have been conveyed to me within Platypus, but the crisis of Joe's presidency and the contention between Chris and Richard in 2021, which I did not attend the business meeting for, come across frequently. And it was mentioned by Chris, and I think it's worth raising again from yesterday, that Platypus is coming on 18 years now. I'm among the last people who have been born before Platypus was founded who's going to join this organization. And increasingly, in the horrific circumstance that Platypus goes on another like 20 or 30 years, I think I can only ask it rhetorically, what are we trying to appropriate from internal crisis? Platypus seems distinctive because its function is distinct from the rest of the left in that we are intentionally oriented towards reflection, both on the left but also of our own activity. And so I don't have an answer, but I can only sort of pose it in an abstract sense of what are we supposed to take from like the Joe's presidency and Chris and Richard's disagreements? Because I'll be completely honest, I don't understand. This is something that's completely beyond me, beyond the fact that it expresses the fact that we seem to like care about problems within the organization, which is good, I guess.
Yeah, I was very much listening to what you were saying, Andreas. I think that the crisis in our organization, of course, reflects the crisis in our broader context, and I think the consolidation of the political consolidation of post-neoliberalism. Like this is what I would highlight from Andreas's comment, right, is that from his remarks is the non-synchronous, but certainly deeply interrelated broader historical context, including that of capitalism itself, capitalist politics, the significance of Chris stepping down from the presidency, writing the death of the millennial left, stepping down from the presidency, the DSA becoming wholly integrated into the Democratic Party, becoming an agitator for the election of Democrats, the election of the squad in 2018, and Joe saying that maybe Platypus needs to do something different, right? I do think that, and of course, I was there saying all along, Platypus was built for this moment, and people throw that in my face. Right? Throw it in my face, right? Because what Andreas says deeply resonates with me. Right? What if our history is just preparing us for this moment? Right? What does it mean if we miss the tricks now? What does it mean if we're not doing what we can do now? Now, obviously, I don't think we can do what we do now without reflecting upon the difficulty of our project. I don't think we can, allow ourselves to be consumed with impatience over this discussion. But I do feel that, I certainly didn't think that there was going to be anything but a capitalist revolution in my time. Right? The profundity of it was breathtaking. Actually, right? The profundity of the crisis of capitalism politically is astounding, right? We may not have lived through a once-in-a-half-century crisis. We may have lived through a once-in-a-century crisis, right? It's an astounding reorganization of global capitalism that's had an immense effect on the left. Its entire organizational structure has been deranged in both the meanings of that term. And I think that we require to project out of our activity. And why is the history of Platypus important? Why is our being a millennial organization important? Because it connects us to the history of the 20th century. Right? That moment of intergenerational transmission from the new left, where all of the problems of the new left, all the anxieties, all the debates, all the antipathies, all the confusions inherited from the new left came back up. Why? Because they had to teach millennials. Right? That's what the issue was. Right? And I talk about this in my introduction to The Reader, Volume 2. I think that our access to the deeper history of Marxism is through that moment of intergenerational transmission. And that we have to teach, and if I may say, Ben, the significance of these crises. The significance of, and I know, like I said, I know it sounds like super esoteric and precious and overwrought. First phase, second phase, third phase, upturn, downturn, blah, 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 this internal event, these wider historical transformations. But if that pedagogy, if that historical consciousness can't, that's to me the most fundamental question of the viability of Platypus. Is the doing of Platypus activity, because that's all that we can do is address a 19-year-old, an 18-year-old and say, what are you interested in? You put on a panel, right? You pursue your interests. This project is for you. If you can't pursue your own interests on the left, it can't work. And yet, through that member initiative-driven activity, history is projected, the organization is actualized. Who's my regional coordinator? Why are we organized in chapters? Who do I ask questions to? Right? Why do I have their phone number? What am I allowed to call them about? Right? What are we talking about? Right? If that doesn't emerge out of that immediate activity of getting young people to build a chapter and undertake activity on their own campuses, then I think indeed we need to revisit the crisis of Joe's presidency and so forth. But obviously I have argued that in these distressed conditions, in fact, not only can we continue, but it is absolutely necessary to continue.
We should get other questions.
Yeah, we'll move on to the next question.
All right, thank you. I found all of the inputs really good, but I want to go back to 3 points. So one is what Ben raised about the European conference, right? Like Platypus is where you go to when you fail. I think this is not problematic because it's true, but because it's untrue. If people who failed on the left came to us, we would not be sitting here and having this conversation. Not at all. And this needs to be clear, I think. So this is a misconception on the left itself, right? So I'm very glad for you raising it. It's not a critique. On Laurie's and Richard's response to Andreas, while I think this is again like kind of true what you're saying, I'm sorry for saying this, I found it kind of unhelpful. Because it is true that the membership was very capable of navigating this crisis, right? Like it did not look like Platypus was falling apart. But it's also subjectively deeply influential for Platypus. Young members, members of the ORCOM, former members of the ORCOM keep raising it as an important point and as an inflection point. And you, Laurie, said that Ephraim was, if I remember it correctly, right, like was really like the first president of Platypus or the best president. It was like some great superlative, right? And this was also brought about by Joe's presidency, and it led to Ernst's presidency, both of which are the only presidencies apart from Chris, which lasted longer than a year. So this was critical for our organization, I think. One other point which all of you brought up, which I found important, is about like, you know, we love to read Adorno and like thought boost, identity thinking, get the hell out of here, right? But we are of course reproducing it. And this goes back to, I think, something, I guess Andreas raised it, right? Like, while we are not producing a Weltanschauung in an objective way, we are very much doing so subjectively. Each of our members will tell you we do not have a position, we cannot judge the world politically, yet all of us do, all the time. If you think you don't, there's a problem. Check yourself. And really, this is where I feel like what was very, very good about this conversation was that it helped to show in how far we cannot simply identify things in Platypus, right? Like I've seen this over the last years, that metaphors which were very helpful to explain Platypus, sometimes, not all of the time, but sometimes are being used as dogma. They're used as like answers, as explanations, where they are hints and tools for you to navigate this very much esoteric activity, right? Like esoteric means for the initiated. This is very much what we're doing. And I think this is also something which we can only work through productively, and I very much hail Andreas' idea of like talking about, are we falling into pseudo-activity, can be a smokescreen and pseudo-activity in itself, right? But nonetheless, I think it's important to, again, like check, do we think that we maybe know more than we really do? Because we are necessarily and accidentally sectarian, I would say, right? Like we didn't plan to be sectarian, that's why it's kind of accidental, but it's also necessary because of how the millennial left evolved. And we are this hyper-intellectual Marxist sect, of course, no doubt. Again, if you think we're not, check yourself. The question is, what does this mean? And therefore, again, also to all of the members of the point Laurie raised, right? And also Spencer, you need to make this into a thing. But Platypus itself is also more tasking, I guess, on younger members, because there's the 165 issues, the many conferences, the uncountable. I think no one has counted how many panels I teach them.
Ethan has become close, but
yeah, so like just to maybe
Yeah.
to bring it to an end, right? Like with the questions, I also invite all of you, and this is something I wanted to say on the panel before. Keep your questions as simple as possible for you, right? Like you don't need to show to anyone that you're smart. We know already, and it's also not about like 20 years from now the archives. Oh, people are going to read my sophisticated questions. It's about, can you help facilitate the conversation on the panel in a way which it would not happen without us. Sorry for the monologue.
I want to answer this because I think I'm sort of a recipient of this problem. Again, I'm a newer member, and so I'm particularly in a situation where it's like I'm inheriting experience rather than like digesting it directly. And I'm a sort of middling Zoomer, and like one of my worst traits that sort of perfectly encapsulates the generation is that I really am a chronic poster, and that manifests on the list. I do post a lot, and one thing I've been personally trying to work through is really actually relating that to like doing Platypus, that it's not just like posting to the list, although I think that people should post more, which is a minority opinion. The point being that regarding this question of like, is the critique of Platypus as like inadequate itself like Platypus dogma? Yes, which is why, the sort of conclusion that I've come to is that the question of our adequacy has to be borne out in practice, which is fundamentally difficult because we are not political. And so the character of our practice is really seeing how the left has digested us. And then that is sort of translated again into our fora. It's a sort of cyclical process, although I think actually this is not the best metaphor, but I can't think of anything better right now. I don't want to take up too much time.
I obviously took a lot for granted, and I do want to clarify with my statement of 2019. What I whispered to Andreas was like, I think the big issue about 2019 is Chris stepping down, as Spencer put it. And I don't really position that in terms of Joe. I do think that there was a wrong calculation around Joe, and I do think that there was a problem in that outcome of that year, which I was not in, did not see it coming. So that is a crisis. But for me, I've repeated this often, for me, Platypus was in crisis from day one. No kidding. And I've said this for over a decade already.
It's also what Joe said.
And probably because I told him. Sorry, but it's true. I have experienced 18 years of classes of Platypus, and each time it is different. There was also the crisis around Ian's presidency. Mad crisis. Thank you, Adoni. Whoever was there, there's only a few of us left. Ian wanted to transform Platypus into a cadre of people in support of like the Iranian resistance, right? Like, meaning Ian, you can clarify yourself if you're listening to this, it would be great. But it was like a very specific moment. Second, Jeremy Cohen and co, they too proposed an academic Marxist school that we shut down. So I made that comment because I was like, we've constantly been faced with these questions. The crisis deepens because we're growing, we're in new areas, and yes, we have to reconsider the questions again. But for me, why I diminished the Joe presidency a little bit, like at that crisis, because I really have been experiencing the same problem for 18 years in different ways. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to respond to that comment. I mean, first of all, I agree with Stefan about Platypus being sectarian. I think it's always been sectarian. I think it's its nature. Second of all, with regard to the Joe crisis and the Richard crisis, obviously I can't be objective about the second. But politically, I don't think that either amounted to anything. And just because the obvious forces, I mean, insofar as Joe or I was contending with Chris, obviously overwhelmingly Chris had the support of the organization. So there was no real crisis in the organization. What's interesting to me is the extent that these crises have this kind of afterlife, this ideological afterlife. And that's the real significance, for example, of the Richard crisis, which again seems to me to have been a pseudo-crisis. Except that it potentially almost got me expelled.
Does anybody else have any comments on that question?
Can I raise a second point, if possible? What I think is interesting between Lori's and Richard's comments, and Lori, maybe if I can prod you a little bit to elaborate, is there's this commentary on the sort of permanent character of crisis within Platypus. And Richard is raising the point that it seems not to really have borne out in any meaningful sense in our activity. So I'm wondering what you think about that. How does it translate into the conversation? Because I'm not sure, and I've been wondering about that. And it seems like that's sort of like the big question, not to put it just on you.
Maybe it's a bit pithy, but I just think Richard got bored with the left and stopped being able to learn from it in a way that a lot of us are still learning from the death of the left.
Right. If nobody else has any comments, we can move on to the next question.
Yes, can I ask a question? So I wanted to raise a couple of things. I mean, one was in response to this conversation about the third presidency and crises. Okay, I think that according to Andreas, and the way that he's organized the history of Platypus, for him, we decided to carry on in 2019, but haven't fully digested what that decision was about. So it's about the post-2019 hangover, right? In ways in which we had to digest the decision not to become like the Frankfurt School after the Jeremy Cohen and Ben Shepherd moment. And we have to now decide what it meant that we're not a non-for-profit organization organized in the way that Joe proposed. And I think that what's meaningful about that decision was the demand that we change because circumstances had changed and because the millennial left was over. And we're still living in the hangover of that. So I think that's how we make it meaningful. Otherwise, we're just like crises. And so it's like, how do we make it intelligible so that we can further our own self-consciousness of the organization? So that's just a point in response to that. So I suggested last night in the interview with Chris that there are ways in which certain diagnoses of failures and defeat can sometimes become an impasse to recognizing new opportunities. I think that Platypus has an accumulated way of thinking about its own activity. So one of the things that Lori brought up was, and I'll return to that former point, but one of the ways that Lori characterizes is the dissolving of ideological obstacles. Another way that we talked about Platypus in the early years was the division of labor on the left, right? So that the left would carry out its activity and that Platypus could deepen the reflection of its activity, hosting the conversation. Lori brought up the dissolving of ideological obstacles, or what Ian at one point called creating the swamp. I think that at one point, I forget if it was Ephraim, I forget who said this, but the question is, well, have we repopulated the swamp? Or perhaps another way of putting it, has draining the swamp actually created some conditions for some suspicious vegetation that we can't quite make sense of? Right, so Ben raises in terms of the disintegration of the neo-social democratic turn now has raised this problem for us of Maoism, neo-Stalinism, and what do we make for that? It doesn't seem like it gives us better conditions for thinking. Right, so is it good? Did we drain the swamp? What did we do? Okay, so I think that if we make an assessment of how Platypus, and stay with me, like failed, right, to become like a successful part of the division of labor on the left, or failed to dissolve ideological obstacles, okay, are we recognizing like, what we aim to do? So I really am sympathetic to Richard's opening salvo, that the statement of purpose wasn't about we have to host the conversation, but rather how to create the conditions for reconstitution of a Marxian left. And that's still the goal for Platypus. So in digesting our history as an organization, I think we have to be careful not to hold on to ossified ways that we've conceived of our project before in order to recognize how we might be changing. I think this is also in the organizational committee report. Do we recognize how we're changing? So because we might, in holding on to certain self-conceptions, get in the way, right? In the same way that the undigested quality of the old left in the new left got in the way, perhaps, of the new left being able to recognize a real possibility in this post-World War II period. Like the new left maybe had a real opportunity to change the world, but maybe it wasn't able to fully digest the failures of the old left. Similarly, I think, and maybe I'm stretching here, but we have to be able to assess the way in which Platypus, as a millennial organization, wasn't able to achieve certain goals. And yet, right, we have to be careful in how we take stock of that so that we could recognize the new and how we need to change.
Thanks, Ben. Building on what you just said, I do think we are lagging behind the curve at the moment. Because you raised or not just you, but in general, Spencer as well raised it, the generational transmission of knowledge of our activity as sort of the, I don't want to say litmus test, but that's the word that comes to my mind, so I'm going to use it anyway. A litmus test for the viability of our project. And I think given the fundamental nature of the current change of our way of life, I do think we are lagging behind the curve of what the death of the millennial left actually means for the current transformation of the world. And I think that's a problem, and I think that's something we need to think about.
Yeah, I think one way of thinking about this question that your comments can provoke in me is, a shibboleth, to raise Stefan's, we have these metaphors, these shibboleths in Platypus that maybe become empty, but also that, I think even more tricky sometimes seem no longer to apply, is, and this again was raised by the remarks about post-neoliberalism or neo-postmodernism, is the left-centric view of history, right? This old language of Platypus, right? Can we understand the present as the unfolding of the collapse of the left? Right? Can we understand most proximately this capitalism as built by the left? right? That used to be a very simple argument to make. We could rely on the David Harveys. We could, point out Adolph Reed. We could say how, look, see, this is black nationalist / multicultural capitalism. This is second wave feminist capitalism. This is new social movement capitalism. This is post-administered society capitalism. All of those things, and we could say the new left built this, right? Now I think that's grown more opaque, right? It's a heavier lift to explain to young people how, I don't know what, is this Trump derangement syndrome capitalism? Right? Like what's going on? Is this Trump derangement syndrome on the left? Right? These sorts of questions, that have to do with the liquidation of the left into capitalist politics, our attention to capitalist politics. Right? I can't remember who was it that was recently asking me. I think it was when we were in Charlottesville, maybe someone was asking me, is it true that we never used to have news articles from the capitalist press posted to the listserv? Right? No Fox News, no Tucker Carlson, no Glenn Greenwald, no, whatever it is, CBS News, what have you. And I answered, yeah. Right? It was like articles from like left publications. Right? We viewed the present through the publications of the left, through the discussions of the left, and so I think just wanted to pick up on this issue of the second decade, the sixth phase, some of the things that were, I think, implied in Pam's remarks that way, to think about, what is it, and maybe to put a point on Andreas' comment, what would it mean to be ahead of the curve, thinking through capitalist politics, right? Ahead of what curve? Right? Because we used to be very clear, we're ahead of the curve of the left, right? Now the question is really anticipating history itself.
Just one sense. History itself is the product of the failure of the left at this moment, right?
Right.
But it's interesting what that means today, exactly at the transformation of neoliberalism to something else.
Any other comments? All right.
Question?
Yeah, we'll go to the next question.
By the way, can we get some younger members to ask questions? Go ahead, Gabe, by all means, but I'm just saying, we've only got poor Ben on this panel. Yeah.
So, well, I wanted to respond to what Lori was asking this question of Ian, and so I asked Ian if he would respond. So I'm going to actually just be a little bit of his mouthpiece.
Yeah, please.
So, Ian says...
I wanted him in the room.
He's listening. We did too. He says, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the PR has stopped doing journalism on the left, and I would love to see that return. I'm wondering why that happened. It seems like from the list, people attend a lot of events, but only report about them there. I'm curious why. I had other things, but I'll leave that.
On the PR, one formulation that we did have is that the Platypus early on, I know these formulations, it was the review of the left, right? Like just catching on to Ian's point that like really much, also we were like doing a review of the left. And a lot of the young activists were themselves writing about kind of their experiences with the left. We have like this 68 reenactment article. We have different symptomology, but also our own, right? Like we were really sort of, I did an interview with Rachel Hahn on like, you know, like Maoism and the SDS and like red baiting. We were definitely, but I think that the thing is that the PR has also like molded, shifted, like adapted to different conditions. There was a whole like 7-year period where Platypus members just wouldn't write at all except Chris. Then that like got changed throughout 2019, right? Like, so like there's been different moments where the PR has been able to be a different kind of tool. I think the constant there, however, has been interviews with the left and the transcripts.
I would just say that, I mean, and here I differ probably from the rest of the panelists here, that I think it's important to focus on the very long-term perspective historically, and not on just the questions of generations and phases, which I think Platypus does too much in my view. So for me, the real problem is the short 20th century, particularly the first part of it. And I think that the deep crisis of Marxism in the beginning of that period. I would also say that we have to, I mean, I think it's interesting that the PR has not been sufficiently discussed in terms of hosting the conversation. And I think we should ask questions about why we don't have our, I mean, I think we should both encourage our members to appear on panels more. I know that there was resistance to that, and also to write articles for the PR. I think that there was a tactical judgment, again, I emphasize tactical, about why that would not be a good thing. I think we are coming, and here again I will emphasize the whole problem of the short 20th century. We're coming to a period where there are basically, we're losing the sense of why the true sectarian left that once had a sense of being listened to, why it might make sense to listen to them, what point they would have. In other words, the Sparks are not like what they were before. And this is part of the general deterioration of historical consciousness, in which the history of the left appears as a history of fragments that are endlessly scrambled and re-scrambled. And I think we need to start paying attention to that process and to, okay, I'll leave it there. Go ahead.
I'm speaking here as a tabula rasa that's not very rasa. I'm not terribly familiar with the like comprehensive history of PR in terms of like the proportional substance of like where we orient our activity in terms of like digesting it through the PR, like how much of it is interviews, how much of it is transcripts, where's the journalism, etc. But without really giving a concrete comment on it, what I find peculiar from my standpoint is that the shift to interviews and transcripts as far and away the bulk of the PR, and it took me a while to really get on board with like keeping up with the PR. It's a habit that you have to develop. Corresponds to an implicit assumption, and I don't think it's like the editorial board that has this, but I think it's a reflection of the organization as a whole, that the conversation that the left ought to be reading, because the PR is not like internal, is the conversation in Platypus. Like we do an interview and we have a panel, and like that is how we indicate that like we're ahead of the curve, as Spencer talks about it. I don't know, maybe. But it just seems very peculiar that that's sort of been the trajectory of how we understand like our adequacy, that there isn't like a place for, soliciting just like an article without really our engagement in it.
Look, there was a real, in my editorship, I was very proactive in pursuing solicitation of articles that were building upon previous solicitations. There was this real sense of establishing a continuity. Like Iran was something that we had a thread going for multiple issues, like for years, not more than a decade, right? And like when I moved to London, I got a piece from the CPGB member on Iran there, but I also got a German member from Leipzig who was in our London reading group to get us an anti-Deutsch article about Iran, right? Like it was this very conscious sense that we were using the PR to build on this thread particularly, and there was many other examples of that. But just to name one example. Now I think that the reviews of the left has actually started happening in the podcast. I think sort of the reflections of Platypus on the podcast and the like going to left events, like it's been a place where like that has started, like that's definitely taken its move there, right? But yeah, and you know, thinking about crisis, like I don't want to flatten all the crises of the 18 years. I know I sounded like that too. But two other very different crises was I think that the starting of the podcast created a crisis in New York. When I was in New York, it was very, very challenged, and I had to fight for it. For weeks, if not months. And also, the
name of it.
Platypus, yeah, the name also, right? And like, I don't think only, but it sort of represented this thing about like turning inward. Like, Platypus has nothing to say was Sunit's point. We really are not there to like explicitly have this positive history, and that kind of like tension was presented in the podcast. But I think the other controversy was, again, more perhaps potentially external activities was Chris deciding to start the campaign for a socialist party. I think that also created a different kind of crisis internally, which was about the same time that Chris was deciding to step down. So, like, just wanted to sort of flesh out that there's very different crises at different moments that I didn't want to flatten all into one.
Right. So, I think we'll take one more question.
One at the max, right?
We're already almost half an hour.
Yeah, we need half an hour.
Why don't we get
We
two
haven't-
comments from?
No, we started two.
members?
Oh,
I
okay,
mean,
good.
They haven't been kicked out yet. So that speaks to something.
Yeah, no, I have seen it.
Well, let's get one more question. And then we'll wrap it up.
Thanks. I guess I don't know if there's going to be time to actually get an answer to this question. Well, raise it anyway.
What's your name? I don't know who you are, sorry.
I'm Flynn. Hi. I joined Platypus a couple years ago. I've been on the Georgetown chapter in DC. Though I am myself a millennial, not a Zoomer. But one of the refrains on the panel was Platypus. It's essential for Platypus that members are pursuing their own interests. This is good.
Yeah.
They need to be pursuing interests that are kind of internally intrinsically motivated. And thinking about the new members, the Zoomer members, the one thing we know for sure that they're interested in is that they're interested in Platypus. And frequently, they're not interested in very much else on the left other than Platypus. That itself might be a legitimate recognition that the only thing that the millennial left produced that was of any value was Platypus. And the way that they're kind of taught to make sense of that impulse is, well, if you're so interested in Platypus, you should be doing Platypus, you should go out, you should talk to the left, you should meet the sectarians, right? And so, but it's easy to see how that produces this anxiety about pseudo-activity, that they're kind of following the orders they've been given, not out of a genuine interest in the PSL members they're talking to, right? But because they were interested in Platypus as an object, actually. And so I'm wondering, of course, panels like this are one productive way that Platypus works through that interest. But this activity is, it couldn't possibly be a self-sustaining organizational activity, and one way to signal that is that this is a private activity. No one else is invited except for us to think about Platypus. So I guess I'm wondering, what would it mean, or how might Platypus be able to render itself as an object for Zoomer members to do Platypus on, if that's what it would mean for them to pursue their interest in Platypus? And, for example, one concrete question, this is a legitimate question, would Platypus interview Joe about the 2019 convention and publish it publicly in PR as kind of a reflection in salient moments in the history of the millennial left.
I have a very brief response, which is that it's already been proposed, is that someone, particularly would be good as a young Zoomer member, actually write a history of Platypus.
Every convention.
Thanks for that point, Blaine. Sorry. I think that's really, really, really important, and I think it hits home a certain impression I had too, because like I became a member in 2019 of this organization. I was not part of the left like in any serious way before, and how do you say, like I was interested in Platypus, not the left at first. I do like to say this because I find it funny looking back. When I became a member, I wanted to create a questionnaire to send it to all leftist groups in Vienna. And so I wanted to create this like Wikipedia page for the Viennese left. So this questionnaire had like questions, you know, when were you founded, how many members do you have, what's your ideological orientation, stuff like that. And Jim Calbeck was the chapter head back then, was like, you fucking nuts. What's wrong with you? Why do you want to do that? But he wasn't saying it like that.
He probably was.
No, but the point I'm getting at is that it was only Platypus through which I was interested in the left. Like, but the thing is, what happened and what we managed to do in Vienna, I think, and we see the products of it now. I mean, there are 6 or 7 people of us here at this convention. Is that we created an interest for the left through Platypus. That was, I think, I don't know, that's the basis of how we were able to reproduce the chapter in Vienna on a very concrete level. We were able to use Platypus to use the power of its critical framework in order to make sense of this weird impression you get when you watch a panel. It's really like, I'm sorry it's a vulgar analysis, but like a wine tasting or something like that, when you kind of get that there's a difference between like the $2 cheap shit and like the really expensive stuff, but when you don't have any knowledge about whatever it is that you are actually tasting, that you are experiencing, you will not be able to understand what's going on. So when you have a certain amount of knowledge, you know, if that is brought to you through a very specific pedagogy we have, you do actually see stuff that wasn't there before. It's like really discovering another dimension to that specific experience of listening to a panel between the fucking MNPD in Germany, the Sparks, and this Russian millennial Wertkritik historian we had in Berlin. It's like watching, I don't know, like modern artwork that is completely dissonant. But at the same time, you can't shake the impression that this dissonance was consciously arranged for you to, you know, obsess about, and for you to obsessively find the meaning behind it.
I'll take it.
Keep getting questions.
I'll keep it brief. I know we're well over time. The tension, and I actually completely agree with Andreas. I think that you're making amazing points. And the tension there is that the left is sort of decreasingly willing to participate in the modern art that we're making. That, you know, of course, this is also a bit of a flash in the pan moment, but personally, organizing the Israel-Palestine panel at Northwestern was like the worst experience of my life. It was horrible. It took probably like 25 emails to secure 3 panelists.
You're not the first.
And no, I don't think it's unique, but what I'm saying is that hopefully this isn't a permanent thing, but that despite the fact that the left is increasingly willing to say it's dead, where they're willing to say it is highly ambiguous, and we need to succeed in ensuring if Platypus is like the capable force of turning that into something productive, that it happens here. But what I want to touch on is that something that characterizes, I think, a lot of sort of like my generational milieu is this sort of cultivation of an ironic detachment that sort of like being like overly critical or contrarian, nothing new, but like that is like the basis for like good thinking intrinsically. And I've had to sort of work through that. And, you know, I pointed in my opening remarks to like the necessity of engaging with the left because we want to learn from them. But Platypus also has opinions. Platypus doesn't have a line, but we don't have a line because we don't think that there's any politics that can be done today. Not that there wasn't like a correct picture of Marxism that we use to characterize the 20th century, or the 19th century. And so when we want to engage with the left and draw something meaningfully from them, it is a delicate balance between, like, people join Platypus because they agree with it. That you have to strike a balance between, like, genuinely knowing that there's something to be said that, like, we might not already know, and also recognizing that there's a deep deficiency to it. One of the things I hate about anthropology is the, like, idea that there's just, like, all of these infinite standpoints that are equally valid, and, like, the function of anthropology is to, you know, like, get in there and, like, not impose your own worldview on it. What Platypus adds to that is the understanding that there is something that's shared, and there might be something that's correct, and we can be confident in the fact that there's, you know, wrongness in what we're engaging, but the sort of the rational kernel of anthropology is that there's a rational kernel to all of the different standpoints we're engaging with, and that's what we have to excavate. The answer to how is much harder.
I have a question
Yeah.
for you. So you mentioned Israel-Palestine, which was the issue du jour. So of all the panels, I have no idea how many Platypus did in all the events. Like, do you think that they were worthwhile? Or they're just a record of a crisis on the left? I mean, did any of them really seem valuable or educational or prompt any interest? Or did anybody say anything really interesting?
I don't know. The one thing I'll say, and this is something to digest, is that the Israel-Palestine panel at Northwestern, I know it's been very different at other campuses. I know the NYU panel had amazing turnout. The Israel-Palestine panel at Northwestern was attended by Bill Ayers' wife, or girlfriend, I'm not sure. The girlfriend of Gabe, the Gabe Schatz's girlfriend, and Platypus members and contacts. There was no one outside of our milieu that attended, and I think that's strange and worth considering. And it's a pretty acute expression, and it motivated my opening remarks on the point about, you know, a third party that ought to be our audience. That there really is a question of, like, are we just doing this for ourselves? That could be good. That could be, like, fruitful. Maybe it does just have to be like Platypus, just like.
Was it helpful for Platypus members in context?
That's a harder question, and I don't know if I could formulate a good response before, like.
Hold on.
Before,
In
yeah,
Vienna it
before
was. We need to.
Yes, yeah, let's.
In Vienna it was. Good.
All right. Yeah.
All right, everybody, we can all right, well, first off, round of applause.